Hi, everybody. Welcome. If you can take a seat, that would be great. So I'm Rose. I'm one of the PyData co-organizers. And this is my first time doing the intro, so bear with me. So at first, I want to just thank our sponsors. So NumFocus for sponsoring the Meetup, TD Ameritrade for sponsoring this beautiful space, and Midas for sponsoring the food. So a couple of points. Emergency exits. So both the door you came in and then behind here are emergency exits. If you have any feedback, there is an email address and a Twitter at the bottom of here, but you can also talk to any of the organizers, co-organizers, myself, Sean, and Ben, who's sitting at the back, or standing at the back, excuse me. And also, we're in a borrowed space. Please be kind, throw things away, treat it like you like it, because we do like it, and we'd like to stay here. So after Katie gives her lovely talk, we'll have a Q&A at the end. So please make sure that unless it's very, very quick, you hold your questions until the end. Please phrase your question in the form of a question, so no long monologues. Try to keep it to 30 seconds or less. Avoid long statements or monologues. I got ahead of myself. There's time for open discussion and conversation, both with the speaker and your other attendees after the Q&A. So now I'm going to read our PyData Code of Conduct. PyData is dedicated to providing a harassment-free meeting space for everyone, regardless of gender, sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, disability, physical appearance, body size, race, religion, or experience. We do not tolerate harassment of meeting participants in any form. All communication should be appropriate for a professional audience, including people of many different backgrounds and levels of experience. Sexual language and imagery is not appropriate for any of our meetup events. Be kind to others, do not insult or put down other attendees, behave professionally, remember that harassment and sexist, racist, or exclusionary jokes are not appropriate for PyData. Attendees violating these rules may be asked to leave the meetup at the sole discretion of the meetup organizers. Thank you all for helping make this a welcoming, friendly event for all. So we're going to do a quick icebreaker, which was suggested by Katie, our lovely speaker. And do you want to, I believe in you. Okay. This is a topic about which I know very little. But our icebreaker today is, what is your favorite subreddit? What? With the PyData Code of Conduct in mind, please. So I'll give you a little bit to chat among your neighbors. Hi, everybody. Let's come back. Obviously, a topic of much excitement and brought about a lot of conversations. So I hope that you learned something new about your fellow PyData attendees by learning about their favorite subreddit. So this month in data science, there's a Michigan AI Symposium on October 19th on North Campus. The call for proposals closes October 5th. So you can take a look at the website here. And our next event is, we debated how her name was pronounced, but is Tanya Rudakovic from Devoted Health on pipelines that bend but don't break. And that's going to be on Wednesday, October 2nd, also here. Are there any community announcements? So for those who maybe haven't been here before, if you are looking for a job, if you have a job, if generally you would have a community announcement, please.
A few things are coming up. The Ann Arbor Art Users Group will be having their meetup tomorrow. You can look for them on Meetup. In addition, the Ann Arbor chapter of the American Statistical Association is having a workshop, Practical Bayesian Computation, which will be on the 21st, of Saturday. It's an all-day class. You can go to the Ann Arbor chapter of the American Statistical Association meetup. Also, there's a couple of the meetups. You might want to look at the Code and Coffee on Saturdays through Tech Inclusive, and Coffee House Coders every other Wednesday night. So those are good things to know.
Great. Thank you so much.
Michigan Dev Fest is coming up September 21st down in Detroit. It's $15. There's actually 2 machine learning data science tracks this year. I'm speaking, but that's not the biggest draw. Yeah, we have Josh Gordon. I don't know if anybody's familiar with Josh Gordon. He's the keynote. So, check it out.
Great, thank you. Anyone else? All right. So now I'm going to introduce Katie. So Katie Bauer was a founding member of Reddit's data science team and currently manages its consumer data science and analytics team. She has previously worked in search, digital advertising, and online retail, and is known for using company hackathons as an excuse to bake cakes at work. So take it away, Katie.
Thank you for having me. Ann Arbor is lovely. I have only been here for a little bit, less than 24 hours, but I've already consumed an irresponsible number of brownies from Zingerman, so I think I'm off to a good start. I'm going to talk to you all about building a time on site metric at Reddit. That's one of the first things I did when I started working there, and yeah, it should be a fun time. So to give you a little bit of information about myself, as this is basically the stuff from the bio, but with a picture of me as a snoo next to it. I have worked previously on natural language search, search engine for things to do, ad tech, retail. I've been kind of all over the data space, and I was one of the first data science hires at Reddit. I've seen our data stack transform tremendously in that time. We were working in Hive when I first started there, which is slow and painful. Now we're entirely in the Google Cloud ecosystem, which is awesome, and we're talking a little bit about that today. I currently manage a team called the Consumer Data Team, which is data science and analytics concerns related to probably the parts of Reddit that you see unless you happen to be a digital advertiser. That's what the rest of the data science team does at Reddit. And I bake a lot of cakes. I've even won awards for baking cakes in the office. This is an actual belt that is sitting on my desk. When you press the champions button, it like makes fireworks sounds. It's pretty awesome.
Is that a pie cake?
It's just a pie. I've also baked pies and bread and lots of stuff. I bake a lot of things. So how many of you have used Reddit before? Okay, that's good. Hopefully the favorite subreddit question wasn't too awkward for those of you who have not used Reddit. Reddit is, some people consider it like a social network. I think of it sort of as an anti-social network because it's not about talking to people you know. It's about talking to strangers about things you care about. It's a lot more like a forum. People mostly come for topical-based communities where you can talk about literally any interest. There's a lot of gaming stuff, but there's also makeup. There's also like support communities for people who have diseases that are quite rare that you'll never meet someone in real life with them. And people have really meaningful, validating conversations. These communities end up having lots of interactions with each other. Some communities like to send from other communities. Some of them have positive relationships, and they all kind of blend together in a way that's weird and wonderful. There's also a ton of cat pictures on Reddit. So if you like that, probably a good place to go. So before we begin, I'm going to establish a few foundational concepts that are important for understanding the talk ahead. Those are sessions, event logs, and something called screen views, which is a concept internal to Reddit, but pretty intuitive. We'll start with sessions. Sessions are a industry-wide concept. It's a pretty standard thing. You can think of them as being like a container for all of the actions that you have on a site when you visit it. And the way it works is anything you do ends up being in that container until there's 30 minutes of inactivity. Then your session expires, and you have a new session the next time you come back. So to give sort of a concrete representation of that, if you come to Reddit, or any site really, at 2:01, your session would expire at 2:31. Then if you do another action at 2:02, then 2:32 would be the time it expires, and that keeps refreshing until you stop doing stuff. That boundary sounds probably pretty arbitrary. For example, if, say, you go to an e-commerce site and you go to the splash page, you see a bunch of shirts, you see one you like, you click on that, but then you get a phone call. You get up and you leave your desk and you're gone for 30 minutes. You come back at exactly 31 minutes and you're on that page of that shirt that you wanted to buy, you add it to cart, and that is a new session. So that artificially creates 2 sessions. That's messy. You could have the total opposite, where you get done with that phone call early, you come back exactly in 29 minutes, and you don't get a new session. This is a super fuzzy thing, but this is an industry standard definition of a session. And even if it is a little weird, the reason that it's standard is because it's like having a different definition of centimeters or something. If you went to a different city, it'd be weird. We all want to know that we're talking about the same thing, so we've all kind of agreed to define sessions this way. The next thing is event logs. The name is pretty intuitive. That's like kind of like a captain's log or something. It's everything that happens written down and time-stamped. This is the foundation of pretty much all commercial data science and machine learning, at least on the consumer web. And this is an example of some events in our data warehouse. This was just like a select star for the 30th of August to generate this screenshot. And of note on here, there's basically a naming framework, which is this thing called source action noun. That's not super important. It's just a way of identifying events. And then there's 2 different timestamps, an endpoint timestamp and a client timestamp. That will be important later. And then some other stuff. There's tons of stuff on these different events, but what's important is everything you do on a website, or most of the things you do, are usually tracked in this way. Event logs are really important. As I said, they're the foundation of a lot of the commercial internet. If your house is burning down, save the event logs, forget the machine learning. You can create a new machine learning system. You can recreate your blockchain, but the event logs are super important because they're the foundation of everything. And they have to be good. Garbage in, garbage out. And finally, screen views. Like I said, pretty intuitive concept. It is just a page is loaded on Reddit and displayed in your browser or your app or whatever you're using to access the site. This is a subreddit that I enjoy. I wouldn't say it's my favorite, but it's called Sububby. It's mangled corporate logos, spelled wrong. It's pretty goofy. But if I happen to open Sububby, I fire a event. Source action noun is global view screen. That is a screen view. This is one of the most common events that happens on Reddit because most people are lurkers who don't comment or post or vote or anything. They just load pages, they look at stuff, they read, they leave. And the fact that screen views are so common, that every single user has them, regardless of whether they have an account or not, that is why we used it as the basis of time on site. And now we're going to get to the good stuff. Yes?
Does that track them like they click a link that takes them to another site, or is it just a Reddit page?
Like you can specifically event like an outbound link, but like I can get into this a little bit, but essentially like we can control tracking for things that happen on our site, but once someone leaves our site, we don't really know what's happening. Yeah. All right. So to build time on site, there were 3 important ingredients. One of which was Google BigQuery, which is a data lake, and it is pretty much all just writing SQL. It's a great analytics tool. It's honestly the tool that I use more than anything else in my work as a data scientist at Reddit. The next is Apache Airflow, which is an ETL framework. ETL, for those of you who don't know, is extract, transform, load, which sounds like a very old term, and it is, but you hear people talk about it a lot in industry. It's something that takes those raw event logs and converts them into something that is business logic. I've done a ton of data warehousing and ETL work as a data scientist at Reddit. And the final ingredient in building time on site was a lot of frustration. But we'll get to that. So let's start with the BigQuery piece. BigQuery, like I said, all SQL, and actually the methodology for calculating time on site was pretty simple. It did involve an advanced SQL function, which is called a window function. Window functions are actually a big family of functions. And they're a lot like an aggregate function where you have like a column you're grouping by and then getting like an average of a number or the maximum or the minimum or the count or something like that. Window functions kind of allow you to do that in place by picking something and partitioning over it and creating a window, so to speak. So to give you an idea of what that looks like, these are some window functions. And actually, this is time on site. Seems pretty simple, right? So here in time on site, we have, let me use my mouse. That's probably a little better than me pointing. So we are taking an aggregate function here. We're getting the max timestamp, and we're partitioning by a unique combination of a user ID, the app they are accessing Reddit through, and their session ID. That's it. You're just getting the max and the minimum timestamp associated with both of those things. And then here you are taking the difference of timestamps and getting that in seconds, and that is a session length. Window functions are really nice because this ends up being a very clean query. There are a lot of different performance characteristics of SQL that become important when you're crunching a ton of data and joining things, which you might have to do if you were using aggregate functions to achieve this. This makes it way simpler, this makes it way easier to understand, and this is very helpful and readable code. What's notable about this query in particular is we are looking at an event called global view screen, and then this other event that is also used in time on site, although it was not originally part of our time on site definition, called post consume post. I also want to point out that there are two different session lengths here, and I'll explain why in a bit. But first, let's talk about Airflow. Airflow is a scheduler. Basically, it runs a bunch of SQL queries for you, and it schedules them with a cron job, but it is very fancy. You can configure it to have dependencies, make sure that like when one task is run, another task will only start running once that one is finished. It allows you to do stuff at custom times of day. It allows you to like make sure that it's always checking if something has completed on a previous day. You can get pretty fancy with it. But I didn't really get too fancy with this in time on site. It was basically just run this every day. And what is interesting about Airflow is that it creates these elaborate graphs called directed acyclic graphs, otherwise known as DAGs. And usually they're pretty straightforward, pretty simple. It's like just a line. This is one of the more interesting looking DAGs that we have at Reddit. This is calculating a bunch of important business metrics. And what's important about this, first of all, you can see the dependency chains where this is just like a check to make sure raw events are populated in the database. Then we run all these different aggregate tables, run another one, hit another check. That check feeds into this thing. More aggregates are calculated, et cetera, until you finally reach the end. But if this never reaches the end because something upstream fails, the entire thing crashes. This was a problem at various points. But again, we'll get to that. For the most part, pretty straightforward, pretty simple. I wrote a SQL query, I scheduled it in Airflow, and voila, I had time on site. But it was not that easy. And that is because of distributed systems. The modern web is a bunch of servers in a cloud somewhere that communicate with your actual device, whether it's your laptop, your cell phone, your PC. And for the most part, this communication goes off without a hitch. They pass information without any problems. But sometimes, they just kind of fall over and they don't. This is where the frustration comes in. Once I had built this time-on-site aggregate, I needed to do some QA. I needed to make sure that things looked the way they were supposed to look. So I started off by just looking at the lengths of sessions. Did they seem like sane amounts of time that people would spend on Reddit? And there were some pretty long sessions, but I mean, I personally can get lost in the comments section of a really good Reddit post, so it wasn't that bad, except there were really, really long sessions. And that, you know, there could plausibly be long sessions where you have like sort of a slow burn of someone being in class or at work where they are constantly hitting that like 29-minute mark where the session doesn't quite expire even though they weren't active for that whole period that the session length actually ends up happening because you're just getting the minimum and maximum timestamp associated with the session ID. But they were also surprisingly frequent, and there were sessions that were actually like full 24-hour periods. And I realized at that point that something was definitely wrong with my aggregate. There was something about the data that was not clean. So I brought myself back into distributed systems world to try and understand what was happening. And if you'll recall, there was 2 timestamps on the event logs. You have this endpoint timestamp and client timestamp. These are timestamps associated with something that happens on like your device, like your laptop or your phone, and the endpoint timestamp is what happens on the server. In general, there's conventional wisdom in industry that if you have a version of data that is generated by a client versus a server, you trust the server, because the server is like one single point where everything is consistent, whereas things might be implemented differently on the desktop site versus the native mobile app. People also do particularly crazy things on their phone. For example, if you are playing Candy Crush and you need to get more lives, you can just change the day on your phone because they regenerate based on time. So people often have very bad timestamps on their phones, and it's not really trustworthy. So I had built time on site using a server-side timestamp. But that was a problem. Normally, timestamps, the difference between a client timestamp and a server-side timestamp is like milliseconds. It's not a big deal. But for some of these, they're actually hours apart. The phone or the desktop app or whatever client was actually accessing Reddit was logging this timestamp way before the server was. Lines 3 and 4 actually have events happening on separate days. And this was really bizarre. I dug into it a little bit more, and I figured out some patterns, one of which was 4 sessions that had this problem of very long lengths. There would be weird bursts of events firing all at the same time, where the server would just suddenly have like 10 events all in rapid succession. And you would also have that happening only on native mobile apps, so iOS and Android. And this was really bizarre, and I went over to talk to an iOS engineer, and it was because of distributed systems. It turns out they make it really hard to figure out what time something happened. And another particularly big problem with native mobile apps in particular, I'm saying the word particular a lot, I'm sorry everyone. The problem that you experience a lot is sending events as you are tracking behavior in an app requires a lot of battery. So in the past, an iOS engineer seeing the performance characteristics of constantly sending events was turning the phone into a bit of a hand warmer. It was just destroying people's battery life. So they had implemented a system that batched up events and would send them all at once. So they would be logged with a correct timestamp, or at least correct according to the device, on the client-side timestamp. But the server would not get them until that batch was sent. And if someone closes their app before that batch was sent, we just don't know about it until days later or hours later or whenever they open their app again. So we spent some time investigating the difference between a client-side time on site versus a server-side time on site. And we found out that the actual relative distance between events on the client was more reliable for calculating time on site, even if the absolute time was wrong. So you would get your actual day that the session happened from the server-side timestamp, and the distance between the events was the client-side timestamp. I felt pretty good about this. I thought I was nearing the completion of the time on site project, but I knew I had to do more QA. Yes?
After that, what happened to the 2 and 3 day sessions?
They were pretty small for the most part. Like, we didn't have that many of it, so it was like a margin of error that we found was acceptable. So as I dug into more QA, I still found some egregiously long sessions. And I wasn't sure what to do about this, so I started to get really granular. For these really long sessions, I started looking at the relative timestamps and just every single event. I actually leaned on another window function, which is called lead, that allows you to create a partition over whatever unit you want. In this case, it was a session ID. And then order, actually, hang on. Haha, it's circle on this slide. A session ID, so just making a window over a session ID and then ordering everything by a client timestamp. So I can see things happening in order. And with the lead function, you can actually create in one row a timestamp of an event and then the event that happened immediately after it, which allowed you to calculate the difference in time between those two events. So I was able to check, are we actually firing events where they should have been assigned a new session? Was there a 30-minute period of inactivity between these events that should have generated a new session ID? And it turned out that was true. There was one thing that was not like the others. And that was all of these session IDs being assigned to events that really should have been at the start of a new session. Our good old friend distributed systems was responsible for this. So the reason that this was happening was that when someone hadn't been using their app for a while and they should have received a new session ID, they were getting an old session ID. So an old session ID, which was associated with events that were happening hours before, was getting appended to the start. Or rather, hang on, I'm going to say this backwards. These events that were really part of a new session were being appended to an old session because the old session ID was being recycled. This is what's known as a race condition or a race hazard, which sounds way more exciting. But it's a common problem you experience in native mobile development, which is where you need things to happen in the correct order, but there's something that you can't control that makes it so they won't happen in the correct order. And in this case, that thing that you can't control is a Wi-Fi connection. Our session IDs are actually tracked on a server, and they are assigned by a server. So if you open up your phone and you get into Reddit on Android or iOS, you will potentially not have a Wi-Fi connection or your phone hasn't connected yet, but you'll be loading a page, you'll be viewing a page, and you'll get a screen view event. And because a session ID was not yet available, you would get an old session ID. And that was causing sessions to be extraneously long. I ended up creating a very hairy subdag within our time on site calculation to deal with this. And the reason for this was that we had a board meeting coming up and we needed to be able to report accurate information on time on site. So I started to do something that was a little insane. For the first version of this, for our browser-based access points for Reddit, which is just like the regular desktop site, the MWeb version when you open up your phone in a browser, the version you get there, and then something called AMP, which is like a Google-specific technology that's not really important to this talk, but it's like a cached version of the site that Google serves you if you open up the site from a Google search. Those were all pretty accurate, and we didn't have this problem. But the native mobile apps, Android and iOS, we did have this problem a lot. So the first thing I did was I would order every single Android and iOS session and put that into an aggregate table. And then I would take every single event used to calculate time on site and put that in order in an aggregate table. And then I would use the lead function to get the difference between all of these different events and see if any of them actually should have been assigned a new session. If they were, I then created a table where I corrected all of the events' session IDs, and then I would calculate time on site. That was not worth doing. Never do anything like this, because this is so hard to understand if you did not write it, and even if you did write it, it's hard to understand and debug. This is tech debt. Don't write tech debt if you can help it. Fortunately, I had talked to the iOS and Android engineers, and they told me that they had come up with a great fix to help deal with this problem of orphaned events being given the wrong session ID. And that was something called inactive session 000. When a session ID was not available because the phone could not contact the server, they would just give it this session ID. And at the time, I was so tired of working on time on site that I was cool with that. And it worked pretty well until it didn't. There was one evening where I was actually preparing to go to a happy hour with some of my teammates, and I got an alert from PagerDuty telling me that all of our important business reporting ETLs failed. And as I mentioned earlier, because they were all in the same DAG and Airflow, everything was unavailable. We were about to enter some quarterly planning, so I had an exec who was very angry at me, and I had to fix this. So instead of going to my happy hour, I sat down in the lobby of the building and just started rapidly trying to debug my messy ETL and figure out where it was going wrong. After a couple of hours and a lot of self-doubt, we found ourselves looking at one of these queries that was using the lead function, window functions coming back to bite us. In particular, our problem was coming from the partitioning by session ID frustration, as I mentioned. Session IDs, normally they're recycled pretty regularly, and the average session on Reddit has about 17 screen views. Inactive session 000 had 980,000 screen views in a single day. So having to partition over a session ID that had this many events and put everything in order was killing airflow. Sorting things is one of the most memory-intensive things you can do in SQL. Performance characteristics do matter in SQL if you're crunching enough data. So fortunately, after figuring that out, we were able to implement a fix pretty fast, where we just manually filtered out inactive session 000. I'm not happy with that solution. In part because it's an obstacle that you have to know it exists to avoid it. Anytime a solution requires reading documentation or tribal knowledge or that sort of thing, someone's going to stub their toe. I stub my toe somewhat regularly against inactive session 000 for a variety of reasons if I don't remember to actively filter it out in a query. It's a problem because it establishes a pattern that is then replicated in other cases. The current time on site query actually has a manual filtering of places where people used user IDs in exactly the same way. So we had user IDs like anonymous, we had user IDs like access to chat without login, and a problem with native mobile development in particular is that old versions of the app will be in the wild for a very long time. So if there is a bug in the data logging for that app version, you're going to be dealing with it for the next 2 years. But despite my complaints, time on site's actually in a pretty good state. We have not had an ETL failure for time on site in particular in about 2 years, which is pretty unusual. So where is time on site today? First of all, it's really important for us in terms of understanding user journeys and how users learn about the site and get into the site. In particular, we had a really good analysis by one of our data scientists where they found out that if a new user finds a subreddit and spends 10 minutes on it, they've found a home on the site. They found the community that resonates with them, and they'll come back. And that has informed strategy. It's made it very important to increase discoverability of subreddits. And now we're using time on site to train machine learning algorithms for that purpose. A lot of popular ranking is actually trained by time on site. A lot of other discovery mechanisms like push notifications or trending recommendation units, email digests, all of that is powered by time on site. And remarkably, we're using almost exactly the same definition as the original one that we created 2 years ago. There have been situations where people have thought like, oh, maybe we should track this like more hard-coded, we should do it on the server. There was actually a whole situation where we implemented a new event that was called the heartbeat event that would fire every single time that, well, it fired every 30 seconds that someone had the app open or the browser open. A problem with this was that every single tab would fire an event and people browse Reddit with lots of tabs open. And if data volume destroyed Airflow before, we essentially DDoSed ourselves with that one. But that's perhaps a talk for another time. But yeah, time on site is something that has taught me the value of doing something simple and robust and building complexity from that starting place. And if there's anything you should take away, simple is good. You can get pretty far with simple. Thank you. And now I can take questions.
Question.
Yes.
In your own words, what is the difference between best and hot ranking?
The hot sort is actually like, it's an older vote counting thing. Best is a bunch of different ensembles of machine learning algorithms.
So you best?
It depends on what you like. Best is more personalized. Popular is more of like, okay, that's good. I mean, best is also only going to give you your subscriptions. Popular, it's going to be anything. Yes?
How are we dealing with bots, web scrapers, and other automated hits on the
How are we dealing with bots and web scrapers? Yeah, is that a good summary?
Yeah, well, I would have figured that when you're doing your histograms, you're going to get some weird results like screenshot every 100th of a second.
I mean, we don't really have any ability to track, at least on desktop, if someone's taking a screenshot.
So what I meant was, where you've got users who have very strange behavior, like they come in for a few minutes, you get 100 screen views, per page views?
Sure. We do have bot detection for that sort of thing. We filter them out of like experiment reporting, but for the most part, it's pretty benign. We also have like a registered way of interacting with one of our APIs, which is, I don't remember what the acronym stands for, but it's called PRA. Like we have a pretty robust third-party developer ecosystem who use that, and at least in that case, we know explicitly that it is like some kind of automated service accessing it. Yep.
So imagine this is a streaming type of algorithm that's processing this through Airflow. Like it's doing it in real time?
No, for the most part, it's just like a batched nightly job. A lot of people think they need real-time analytics, but there's very few things that you need to know so urgently that you need to have it in real time. That's like more for like if you want to do like Airflow is not even really a good technology for that. You'd probably want to do something like Flink if you wanted to do like a real-time calculation.
So what is the volume of data on a daily basis for this particular? Because I know Reddit's pretty popular, right? But what's for this particular thing?
You mean for screen view events?
Well, yeah, for the time on site algorithm.
The calculation is very fast in BigQuery. It's like less than a minute to do it for every user for an entire day. The more days you look back, the more difficult it gets and the more it's likely to fall down. But it runs pretty fast.
Is it something that people can call up on demand? Like somebody comes in and says, I want something for 60 days? And
it's like written into an aggregate table. So like if you want to know like what was the time on site for this user for this subreddit for the last 60 days, you can look at that in an aggregate table. That's actually how some of our push notifications work.
So actually I have two questions, I think. First is I just want to clarify one of the last answers. So the batch runs in a minute?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Can you repeat the question?
He wanted to clarify that like running this calculation for every user in a day, that it took 1 minute. Yeah.
Wow.
BigQuery is really nice. I like it a lot. Yeah.
Okay. And the other, so I think the other one is related is, I'm just trying to get some idea of the significance of the 900 and some odd thousand session 000s that you essentially filter out. Is that, how material is that relative to the volume of all the data that you're looking at?
That's really small. Yeah. We receive some 100 billion events every day.
Wow.
Yeah.
And it runs in a minute?
I mean, it's not looking at every single event. It's only looking at the screen views. Yes, in the back.
Do you do anything to handle the possibility of all these idle sessions strung together and overestimating what the time on site actually is?
Sometimes when we're like giving an estimate for an important purpose or like in a huge aggregate, we'll filter out things that are particularly long, like maybe sessions that are over 2 hours or something. But for the most part, it's not too bad. Yes.
You mentioned that this is by user, and you mentioned lurkers as well. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there are some folks who just don't log in. Are you mapping them by IP address, or like how do you think about it, those anonymous users?
Yeah, they're actually pretty hard to track. Like, even people who do have an account, like I'm probably like 4 DAU every day between like having like a main account, like an alt account, like getting on my phone where I'm not logged in. There's a lot of different ways that we can't accurately track like how many people are like one specific user. And for the most part, that's a good thing. Like we don't really want to invade our users' privacies by like linking all of their alts together or anything like that. Yes.
Could you extrapolate a little bit more about how you decided to talk to the iOS engineers the first time around? Did you
Sure.
have a hunch, or was it?
Well, I was looking by app where all these long sessions were occurring. So like, was it on desktop? Like I was just trying to like validate it against other external things that could maybe validate an intuition that I had. And I noticed that like most of them were iOS and Android happening. So I figured I would go talk to the engineer to see if there was a problem with the data itself.
And then when you talked to them, was it just, here's all these patterns? Do you have any idea what's going on, or did you have other specific questions?
Yeah, I mean, I explained what I was trying to do. I explained the situation, and since I was talking about how session IDs were assigned, they were able to find like the specific place where that was implemented, and that made the conversation fairly straightforward. They still had to do some digging, But the fact that I could speak generally to the type of problem I was solving made it easier to search through the code base and find what might be causing it.
What's the turnaround time for finding and then making a change?
It really depends. If it's something that's like, I I guess native mobile development in particular, there's App Store releases. So like if you don't get something in like within that normal release cycle, like you can hotfix it in. But for the most part, like it's not going to go out until like maybe 2 weeks later or something. But if it's like a really important business critical thing, they're going to patch that in. It's a little easier with like web development because you can release at any time for that. But
thinking about like team dynamics, you said you were one of the first hires there. Can you talk about maybe the process over time? Like when you go to the other teams, are they responsive to your needs of like the data science team? Did it take a while for you to get there, or are you just like acting and or reacting to whatever the engineers want?
yeah, that has changed over time. It's evolved, and like a lot of companies have different philosophies about where the data science org should live within their company. At least when I first started at Reddit, we had sort of an embedded model where like data scientists worked with particular product groups. And I was working with a group that had embedded iOS and Android engineers who I could talk to pretty easily. And I was also particularly working on time on site because it was a machine learning focused team, and they wanted to optimize for it. So that made that relationship pretty natural. If you don't have a relationship with that team, like you aren't embedded or you've never worked with them before, like that's usually something you have to cultivate a little bit more. But something I've found to be extremely valuable as a data scientist is just acknowledging that communication is a huge part of your work. Like usually, like if you can explain what you're doing to someone, they're like, oh, okay, that makes sense, and they're happy to help you out. But if you just like dump a spreadsheet or like you like throw a bunch of statistics at them and don't explain, they're like, cool, I don't have time for this. So it's about just like treating people with respect and making sure to, I don't know, come at it in a constructive way.
Oh, I was going to ask, do you use any other data besides the event log?
The
External or another source?
The data science team doesn't really. I mean, like they're like every company is going to have like different types of data. Like you can have like Salesforce data. You could have like HR data, but the data science team is mostly concerned with our consumer, or most of the data science team is mostly concerned with things that happen with the consumer product. We're not really looping in third-party data at all.
Other questions?
Back on culture, do you find there's a kind of a split between the more academic data scientists, the behavioral economists, and the applied math PhDs, and the people, and essentially the team that gets the data ready for whatever model they want to try and build? Do you find there's that split?
Yeah, so to repeat that question, is there like a divide between academic data scientists who are mostly concerned with modeling versus people who like prepare data for modeling? Is that a good summary?
Yeah.
That is going to vary a lot depending on what kind of company you're at. Some companies, like that's all data scientists do. At some companies, data scientists are a part of like the full stack process of like preparing data and then also modeling it. It really depends on what a company needs and where a company is in its stage of life. I definitely am more of the bent of like prepare data. That's most of the work of a data scientist, and then model. Understand the problem, then apply a model. Probably a simple one if you understand the problem well. But bigger companies have a lot more space for people who are doing like pure academic research type work. But a lot of smaller companies, at least in the Bay Area tech scene, there are people who are trying to solve problems with data.
Well, that's one last question. Mark.
How long did this project take you beginning to launch?
This happened mostly over the course of, like the original like main thing was like a month. And then it was like a month later that we had that very critical failure that I missed a happy hour for. And that was like a couple hours of work just debugging and figuring that out.
So we do have some time left over, but I know that for myself, not only to thank Katie for a great talk, but that I will make sure that at 29 minutes in, I will make sure to close my tabs and my browsers.
Thank you.
For the great talk.